Anaxagoras was born circa 500 BC in Ionia, so this is the eastern portion of the ancient Greek world. Milesia would be included in the Ionian area. A little bit of background and some of the primary theses of Anaxagoras. First of all, he did study in Athens, so even though he was from the Ionian area, he did travel and study in Athens, and in fact, he was politically active in Athens, and at that point, he was an associate of Pericles. One of his claims is that the sun is a fiery stone, and that's in contrast to his contemporaries. The convention had it that the sun was a god of sorts, and that would have been normal for the ancient Greek world. So this is a unique claim that he's making, and this is mentioned by Socrates in his trial as recorded in Plato's Apology, when they seem to confuse Socrates with Anaxagoras regarding this claim. There are two central ideas that provide the focus, things you could remember when you're thinking of Anaxagoras. One is mind or nous. We'll talk about that toward the very end of the video. The other one is the hot dog theory, and we'll have to explain that when it comes up. Anaxagoras accepts some of the underlying principles of Parmenides, that is, coming into existence, coming to be, and perishing simply do not happen. There is no such thing. There is only mixture and separation from things that already exist. So what is called perishing or going out of existence is actually separation. What we call coming into being, coming into existence, is actually mixing together. Anaxagoras has three principles that we will talk about. One of them is a homogeneous principle. We can call this H, right? All substances labeled by mass nouns or non-count nouns, I'll give examples in a moment, are homogeneous. The smaller portions are of the same nature as the whole. They are the same through and through. So some examples of non-count nouns are meat, milk, flesh, gold, bone, cake, snot. These are things that are modified by words like more or less, but they cannot be modified by words like several or many or few or 47. These are things that are identifying individual things, right, instead of substances. So these are substances, and I know grammatically sometimes people make this error, but you don't say fewer milk, you say less milk, right? You don't say 47 gold, right? That doesn't make any sense. You could talk about ounces of gold, but you can't talk about 47 gold like you could talk about a count noun like sheep. You can count them. There are 47 sheep. That makes sense. 47 cake, just cake stuff, that doesn't make sense. Right? The substance itself. In any case, for principle H, no matter how small of a part of milk you take or a part of gold you take, it is still milk. Right? It's still gold. No matter how small of a piece of the cake you take, it's still cake. And another principle that's very important for Anaxagoras is the principle of universal mixture, or UM. And this is something I'll call the hot dog principle. I'll explain just in a moment. We can express this formally by saying for any stuff Y and any stuff X, there's going to be some X in Y, and that we could symbolize that more formally with logical notation, but hopefully that makes sense the way it's said. In other words, one other way of saying this is, in all things, there are all things. In everything is everything. So in everything is a portion of everything. Well, except mind. Mind exists, and it's out there on its own. We'll talk about mind later. So I say this is just like a hot dog. What's in a hot dog? Everything, right? So you go to a meat packing plant, you know, they got the ribeyes, they got the hamburger, they have the pork chops, right? And then you have to do something with the hooves and the head, and and these other parts of the animals. And well, you can grind those up and sweep the floor with the leftovers, and you can put all of that in the hot dog, right? But rest assured, USDA and FDA regulations, they're not going to make sure, they're going to make sure that the hot dogs don't have, more than 1% cockroach or anything like that. Sorry for ruining hot dogs if I did there, but any given thing is like that. Any given thing is a universal mixture of everything else. Now, it's predominantly composed of its own parts. So any gold, any of the substances that we talked about in the previous slide, that's what it is primarily, but it's a universal mixture of everything. So grass is mostly grass, but it also has flesh in it. And we know that because grass turns into the flesh of cows, right? From grass, we get cow flesh. And in corn, there must be some feather, since they grow when the chicken eats the corn. So that's universal mixture. There's also this principle of nutrition. The idea here is if stuff Y, and we could use the example of cow flesh that we've mentioned, comes from stuff X, for example, grass, there must be some Y in X already. There must be flesh in the grass already. And that provides the rationale for accepting the principle of universal mixture. Since the opposites come to be from one another, grass and flesh, and so on, each must have been present in the other in order to be separated out from the other. So that's the principle of nutrition. Now let's go back and think about the homogeneous principle and the principle of universal mixture. It seems like they might be a contradiction here. Could they really both be true? If all of the parts of gold are gold, then how could they also contain all things? That seems odd. Well, here's another reason to think now. Consider dividing gold. Say you have a chunk of gold. You divide it. And then you get to the smallest part. Once you get to the smallest part, if principle H and UM are both true, then it has to be both pure gold and also a mixture of everything. And that's contradictory, right? That doesn't seem to make sense. Well, Anaxagoras has an answer for this. His solution is that everything is infinitely divisible, and there is no smallest part to get to that supposed contradiction. So he says, of the small, there is no smallest. Now that means there are no atoms. Later, some of the pre-Socratics talked about atoms, but not Anaxagoras. Right? Of the small, there is no small. Everything is divisible. This is the idea we saw with Zeno, and Anaxagoras affirms that. So there's this part-portion distinction that he makes. And let's think through how this would work with a cake, for example. Suppose you bake a cake and part of it's flour, part of it's sugar, part of it's butter. If it's a cake that I'm going to enjoy, part of it's going to be cocoa. But once it's baked, right, it's not those separate substances. It's cake through and through. If it's been mixed properly and you bake it, you can't isolate the flour by dividing the cake into smaller parts. You can take a portion, but not an individual part. So if on your plate there, you have a crumb of cake, you cut it in half, it's still cake. All of the cake is cake. It's homogeneous, right? So H is true, and yet there's a portion of all those ingredients in every single part. There is a mixture. Maybe not a universal mixture when we're talking about cake, but you get the idea. This is an analogy of how it works for Anaxagoras. So there's a universal mixture of everything. And of course, we're putting aside contemporary physics and what we might do in a lab and so on, things that ancient Greeks didn't have. All right, the other major idea for Anaxagoras is mind. The Greek word is nous, so we have the writing there in the Greek, but we've seen the logos of Heraclitus, we've seen the apeiron of Anaximander, and like those two ideas, we're transliterating the Greek idea when we say nous. We can translate it as mind. Both of those, the logos and the apeiron, provided some sort of underlying rationality to the universe, to the world that we are familiar with. And Anaxagoras has mind that's serving similar purposes. So the concept of mind or nous includes the idea of agency. It moves things. It does things. Mind or nous is alone. It's by itself, so it is not mixed in with the other things we were talking about. It's the finest of all things. It is pure. It has judgment and power, so it has some of those divine attributes that we mentioned when we spoke of the logos and the apeiron. And mind sets all things in order. It's rational, so it moves things. It separates all things through a rotation of sorts, as Anaxagoras called it. Socrates voiced his disappointment that Anaxagoras didn't go on and explain mind a little bit more. This is one thing he would have preferred to hear more about. He was less interested in the idea of the sun being a stone or the other things that we've mentioned. Now, as a final aspect of this, let's consider a criticism here. Let's revisit that concern about consistency. Now, we introduced the principle of nutrition, and the rationale there is that the chicken eats corn and it grows feathers. So the corn has parts of feathers in it to allow for the growth of those feathers after the chicken eats the corn. Right? That's the principle of nutrition. But that would mean, if that's possible, that portion distinction we made earlier is false. There would have to be parts of feathers that actually are separable from the corn. But thinking that they were inseparable was a reason for accepting universal mixture to begin with. But right, this principle of nutrition is kind of a motivation for the principle of universal mixture. So while the homogeneous principle and the principle of universal mixture may be consistent, as we discussed earlier, that seems possible. The motivation for that principle of universal mixture, which is the principle of nutrition, along with the homogeneous principle and the principle of universal mixture, those are inconsistent. In other words, you can't have all three of those principles. Nutrition, homogeneous principle, universal mixture, they cannot all three be true. Or so it seems to me. I'm sure that Anaxagoras, being much smarter than me, would be able to explain this were he here today, but that's a criticism that I leave you with.